Helen stood in a world made of light and steam. It was a humid warmth that smelled of rich soil and chlorophyll and something else, something faintly electric and alive. Glass walls, once shattered and gone, now rose 30 feet into the air, catching the late afternoon sun and splitting it into 1,000 dancing diamonds on the damp concrete floor. All around her, life hummed. Not just the quiet whir of automated misters or the gentle click of climate control relays, but the life of 10,000 tiny green things, thriving in the impossible Eden she and Frank had built. On tiered benches of reclaimed cedar, trays of delicate seedlings unfurled their first leaves. In the central beds, mature plants grew in dense, verdant carpets, their leaves a shade of emerald so deep it seemed to drink the light. And in the heart of it all, in the specialized, blacked-out cultivation chambers, was the miracle. The reason for everything. Nuptiluca anaximanderi. A bioluminescent moss that glowed with a soft, ethereal blue-green light, a living starlight captured from some forgotten corner of the world. A local reporter, a young man with wide eyes and a microphone that trembled slightly in his hand, had called the place the Lumina Greenhouse. The name stuck. He had asked her, his voice full of an awe that bordered on reverence, "Helen, you and your husband started this with $200 and a pile of junk. Now, financial experts estimate the patent on your cultivation method and the contracts with Biogentech are worth, well, north of $20 million. How does that feel?" Helen had looked away from the camera, her gaze drifting past the reporter to a young woman, Maya, who was carefully calibrating a nutrient drip. She saw Frank, his back to them, showing a new hire how to properly brace a sagging support beam, his hands, though knotted with age, moving with the unthinking grace of a lifetime of practice. She felt the gentle warmth on her skin, a warmth that had nothing to do with money. "It feels," she had said, her voice quiet but clear, "like the lights are on." The reporter had smiled, thinking it was a clever pun about the glowing moss. He didn't understand. He didn't know about the cold. He didn't know about the darkness that had come before. He hadn't been there 2 years ago, when the whole town of Harmony Creek laughed at the old fools, Frank and Helen Gable, who had wasted their last $200 on a pile of rusted metal and broken glass. But to understand the light, you have to understand the darkness that made it necessary. To understand the greenhouse, you have to understand the night they lost their home. I need to take you back to the beginning. The house on Sycamore Lane wasn't just a house. It was a ledger of their lives, every joist and nail a testament to a shared history. Frank had framed it himself in the spring of 1968, a year after they were married. He was a carpenter then, young and strong, with sawdust in his hair and a future in his eyes. Helen, a bookkeeper with a mind for numbers and a quiet, steady heart, had managed the budget. She tracked every penny, every invoice for lumber and copper piping, her neat cursive filling the pages of a spiral notebook. They built it room by room, year by year, as their lives expanded. The second bedroom when their son, Richard, was born. The sunroom when Helen discovered a passion for African violets. The sprawling workshop in the back where Frank could lose himself for hours, the scent of cut pine and motor oil a permanent part of the property. For 52 years, that house was their anchor. It was the fixed point in a changing world. It held the memory of Richard's first steps etched into the soft oak of the hallway floor. It held the ghost of laughter from countless Thanksgiving dinners. It held the quiet comfort of two people growing old together, their routines as worn and comfortable as the matching armchairs in the living room. Helen had retired from the accounting firm 20 years ago. Frank had officially hung up his tool belt 10 years after that, though he never really stopped building, fixing, and tinkering. Life was modest. It was predictable. Their social security was enough. Their savings, meticulously managed by Helen for half a century, were a comfortable cushion. They had enough. They had more than enough. Their only real worry was Richard. Richard, their only child, was a man who had mastered the art of the promising start. He was charming and clever, with a smile that could talk a bird out of a tree. But his ventures, always glittering with potential, had a habit of dissolving into dust. There was the real estate seminar business. The artisanal coffee subscription box. The app that was going to revolutionize the pet-sitting industry. each one began with a flurry of excitement and a need for a small, seed investment from his parents. And each one ended with a quiet fizzle, shrug, and a promise to pay them back with the next, even bigger idea. Helen, the bookkeeper, kept a private ledger of these loans. The numbers were unsettling. Frank, the builder, saw the faulty construction in his son's plans but could never bring himself to say no. "He's just finding his footing," Frank would say, his voice hopeful. "This next one is the one." Helen would nod, but her heart felt a cold dread that no balance sheet could quantify. The final idea, the one that would break them, was the biggest of all. Section E. Richard arrived one Tuesday afternoon, not in his usual sputtering sedan, but in a sleek, rented luxury car. He wore a suit that was too sharp, too new. He carried a leather briefcase. He didn't just have an idea, he had a prospectus. "It's called a Viridian Dynamics," he said, spreading glossy brochures across the kitchen table where they had once helped him with his homework. "We're acquiring distressed agricultural properties and retrofitting them for high-yield organic farming. It's green, it's sustainable, and the returns are, well, they're astronomical." He talked for 2 hours. He used words like synergy, and vertical integration, and pre-IPO. He showed them charts with lines that soared ever upward. He painted a picture of a future where they wouldn't just be comfortable, they would be wealthy. A future where he could finally pay them back for everything, 100 times over. "But this one's different," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential, earnest tone. "The window of opportunity is small. We need to consolidate the capital in the next 2 weeks. I've got the big backers lining up, but to secure my position as a founding partner, I need to show significant skin in the game." He named a number. It was a breathtaking number. It was, Helen realized with a lurch in her stomach, almost the exact amount of their entire life savings. The money from the sale of her father's hardware store. The investments that had matured over decades. The nest egg they had so carefully built. "Richie," Frank began, his brow furrowed, that's everything." "I know, Dad," Richard said, his eyes shining with what looked like sincere conviction. "That's why I came to you. I don't want a loan this time. I want to make you my partners." He slid a document across the table. "This makes it official. You're not just investing. You're owners. 50% of my stake." Helen picked up the papers. Her fingers, so used to the crisp certainty of invoices and tax forms, trembled slightly. The language was dense, legalistic. But the letterhead was impressive. The signatures looked real. "We should have a lawyer look at this," she said, her voice small. Richard's smile tightened just a fraction. "Of course, Mom. But the thing is, the signing deadline is Friday. A lawyer will take a week just to get to it. This is a standard partnership agreement. It's ironclad." He leaned forward. "Don't you trust me?" That was the question. The one that silenced all the alarms ringing in Helen's head. The one that overrode the lifetime of evidence Frank had tried to ignore. He was their son. Their boy. The one they had bounced on their knee in this very kitchen. How could they say no? They signed the papers. The next day, Helen went to the bank and authorized the wire transfer. The teller, a young woman named Brenda who had known them for years, looked concerned. "That's a big transfer, Helen. Are you sure?" "It's an investment," Helen said, forcing a smile. "For our future." For a week, the house on Sycamore Lane was filled with a nervous, giddy energy. Frank started sketching plans for a new, bigger workshop. Helen allowed herself to browse catalogs for a trip to see the fjords in Norway. Richard called every day with breathless updates. "The land deal in the valley just closed. We're being fast-tracked for organic certification. The big New York firm just signed on. We're going to be rich." And then, the calls stopped. At first, they told themselves he was busy. A week passed. Then 2. Helen's calls went straight to voicemail. Her texts went unanswered. Frank drove by the address listed on the Viridian Dynamics brochure. It was a mail drop box in a strip mall. The cold dread in Helen's stomach began to crystallize into a terrible, sharp-edged certainty. The first letter arrived a month later. It was from the bank. A missed mortgage payment notice. "That can't be right," Frank said, holding the paper as if it were venomous. "We paid off the house 20 years ago." Helen's mind, the bookkeeper's mind, flew backward. She remembered a few years ago, Richard had come to them with a problem. A debt he couldn't handle. He'd suggested a reverse mortgage on the house. A way to pull out some equity to help him, with the bank simply taking a larger share when they eventually passed on and the house was sold. It had seemed safe at the time. A technicality. But they had to make small monthly interest payments. Payments that had always been automatically drawn from their savings account. The savings account that was now empty. Helen made a call. The second call was to a lawyer. The third was to the police. The truth came out in a brutal, systematic dismantling of their lives. The partnership agreement was a worthless forgery. Viridian Dynamics did not exist. The money was gone, wired from a domestic account to an untraceable offshore one within hours of their transfer. Richard had not just taken their savings. He had taken their name, their credit, their security. He had used their identities to open lines of credit they never knew existed. The foreclosure notice was not a mistake. It was an inevitability. The house on Sycamore Lane, the ledger of their lives, was no longer theirs. The eviction day was grey and drizzly, the sky weeping a cold, indifferent rain. Two sheriff's deputies, one old and weary, one young and uncomfortable, stood on the porch. They watched as Frank and Helen packed what they could into their 20-year-old sedan. Clothes. A box of photographs. The silver teapot they had received as a wedding gift. Helen's box of ledgers. Frank paused at the door of his workshop, his hand resting on the frame. He didn't look inside. He just stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked to the car without a word. As they pulled away from the curb, Helen looked back. She saw a man from the bank tacking a notice to the front door. She saw their neighbor, Mrs. Gable's prize-winning roses, drooping in the rain. She saw 52 years of her life receding in the rearview mirror until it was just another house on just another street. The first night, they checked into a motel on the edge of town. The kind of place with a flickering neon sign and sheets that smelled of bleach and disper. The cost, a staggering $80, felt like a physical blow. They lay on the lumpy mattress in the dark, not touching, not speaking, the silence between them a universe of shared pain. They stayed there for a week, while their social security checks for the month dwindled to nothing. Then they moved into the car. They found a spot behind a closed-down supermarket, a corner of the vast, cracked parking lot that was mostly hidden from the road. This was the low point. This was the darkness. Daylight was for survival. They used the bathrooms at the public library. They ate crackers and peanut butter from the grocery store, a small meal split on the dashboard of the car. They tried to look respectable, invisible. Helen would spend hours in the library, not reading, but just sitting, soaking in the warmth and the quiet dignity of the place, trying to pretend she was just a regular retiree with a home to go back to. Frank would walk. He would walk for miles, his face a grim mask, trying to outpace the rage and the shame that gnawed at him. He had built a house, but he couldn't protect his home. He had provided for his family, but he had been reduced to this. Night was the worst. The cold seeped through the car doors. The front seats, canted back as far as they would go, were an instrument of torture for their 75-year-old bones. Every passing headlight was a threat. Every distant siren was a judgment. They felt invisible and yet horribly exposed. The town they had lived in their whole lives became a foreign country. People they had known for decades would see them on the street and their eyes would slide away, a flicker of pity and discomfort they couldn't hide. The story was out. The Gables had lost everything. Their own son had robbed them blind. It was a tragedy. It was a piece of gossip. For Frank and Helen, it was just the cold, hard ground beneath them. They went to the police again. A detective, a man younger than their own son, listened with a tired patience. "We're looking into it," he said, the same words he'd used a month before. "These international things are complex. It takes time." They went to social services. A harried woman gave them a form for the housing assistance waiting list. The wait was 2 years. They were adrift in a sea of bureaucracy, their personal catastrophe just another piece of paper in a stack on someone's desk. One morning, after a particularly cold night, Helen woke to find Frank staring at his hands. His knuckles were swollen, his fingers stiff. "I can't even make a fist," he said, his voice rough with sleep and defeat. "These hands built a house. Now they can't even keep my wife warm." Helen reached over the console and placed her hand over his. His skin was cold as stone. "It's not your hands that failed, Frank," she said softly. "It was our hearts." That was the moment the despair almost won. The moment the darkness almost swallowed them whole. But the bookkeeper in Helen, the part of her that believed every problem had a solution if you just looked at the numbers long enough, refused to surrender. The builder in Frank, the part of him that knew you could make something from nothing with enough work, was dormant but not dead. They were running out of money. The last of their cash was tucked into the glove compartment. A little over $300. "We need to do something," Helen said one afternoon, her voice flat and resolute. "We can't just end here. In this parking lot." Frank had started collecting cans and bottles, a humiliating but necessary task that added a few dollars a day to their dwindling fund. It was on one of these trips, behind a strip mall near the county clerk's office, that he found it. Not a can. A piece of paper, damp with morning dew, tacked to a telephone pole. It was a notice from the city. Notice of public auction of derelict municipal assets. It was a list of forgotten things. A rusted-out street sweeper. A set of broken park benches. And the last item on the list, Lot 7B, Parcel 44G, unsafe structure. Former municipal greenhouse. Salvage and removal rights. Frank almost threw it away. It was junk. But he brought it back to the car. He handed it to Helen without a word. She read the list, her eyes scanning the pathetic inventory of a city's neglect. Then she stopped. "Greenhouse," she whispered. She read the line again. "Lot 7B. Where is that?" Frank shrugged. "No idea. Out by the old water treatment plant, probably." "It's nothing, Helen. Unsafe structure, that means it's a pile of scrap." But Helen, the observer, saw something else. Not a pile of scrap. An idea. A flicker of a possibility so fragile it was almost absurd. "Frank," she said, her voice tight with an energy she hadn't felt in months. "Take me to the library." At the library, she didn't go to her usual chair. She went to the public access computers. She logged onto the county assessor's website, a system she knew well from her years of bookkeeping. She typed in the parcel number. A map appeared on the screen. Lot 7B was a half-acre plot of land, tucked away behind the decommissioned water plant, bordered by a polluted creek and a chain-link fence. It was a piece of land the town had forgotten existed. She clicked through the records. The greenhouse had been built in the 1950s to grow flowers for the city parks. It had been abandoned in the 80s after budget cuts. A storm in the 90s had collapsed most of the roof. It had sat there, rotting, ever since. The auction was for the right to salvage any materials from the structure. The winning bidder would also be granted a 1-year, renewable, beautification lease on the land for $1 a year, on the condition that they clear the hazardous debris. The minimum bid was $200. "It's a trap," Frank said when she explained it to him back in the car. "They want someone to pay $200 for the privilege of doing their demolition work for free." "Yes," Helen said, her eyes bright. "That's exactly what they want." So, they don't care what happens to the land. They just want the eyesore gone. The lease is the key, Frank. $1 a year. A lease on a garbage dump. A lease on a half-acre of land, she corrected him. Land with a water hookup. Land with an old electrical line. Land that nobody else wants. Frank stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and concern. Helen, what are you thinking? We have $317 to our names. You want to spend $200 of it on a pile of rust. I don't want to spend it on a pile of rust, she said. I want to spend it on a chance. It's something. It's a place. It's not this parking lot. Her voice didn't waver. The bookkeeper had done the math. The risk was total ruin. But they were already ruined. Any number greater than 0 was an improvement. It's still standing, she said, quoting a line from the assessor's report. Parts of it, anyway. The foundation. The frame. Frank was silent for a long time. He looked out the window at the cracked asphalt, at the faded yellow lines that marked out parking spaces for cars that would never come. He looked at his wife, at the fierce, desperate hope in her eyes. The builder in him, the man who knew the integrity of a good foundation, stirred. He let out a long, slow breath. Okay, Helen, he said, his voice heavy with skepticism but not refusal. Okay. The decision was made. The next morning, they drove to the county clerk's office. The auction was held in a small, stuffy room with peeling paint. They were the only ones there who hadn't come for the street sweeper parts. When Lot 7B came up, the auctioneer, a man with a bored voice and a coffee-stained tie, barely looked up. Lot 7B, the old greenhouse. Minimum bid $200. Do I have 200? Silence. Helen raised her hand. Her heart was pounding. I have 200 from the lady in the back. Do I hear 250? More silence. The auctioneer looked around the room, his expression impatient. Sold, he said with a bang of his wooden gavel. To the lady in the back for $200. Helen walked to the front and counted out 10 worn $20 bills. The clerk handed her a receipt and a single, rust-stained key. The gate's probably seized, he said with a shrug. Good luck. They walked out into the sunlight, $117 to their name, owners of a ruin. Frank drove without a word, following the crumpled map Helen held. The route took them out of the familiar grid of Harmony Creek, past the last subdivision, onto a cracked asphalt road that ran along the creek. The water in the creek was a murky, sluggish brown. They found the gate, just as the clerk had predicted. It was a 10-foot chain-link gate, held shut by a thick, rusted chain and a padlock that looked as old as the greenhouse itself. The key slid in but wouldn't turn. Seized, Frank said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. Told you. He got out of the car and rattled the gate. It didn't budge. He walked along the fence line, disappearing into the overgrown weeds. Helen waited, the silence broken only by the hum of insects and the distant drone of the highway. Frank reappeared a few minutes later, holding a length of rusted rebar he'd found in the weeds. He wedged it into the chain and leaned on it with his full weight. There was a loud, groaning crack as the old lock shattered. The chain fell away. Frank pushed the gate open. It screamed in protest, scraping a semicircle in the dirt. They were in. He drove the car through and parked it on a patch of what might have once been a gravel driveway. They got out and stood, side by side, looking at their purchase. It was worse than they had imagined. The structure was a skeleton. A long, skeletal frame of rusted steel beams, like the ribcage of some great, forgotten beast. Most of the glass was gone, shattered into a million pieces that glittered like malevolent diamonds in the overgrown weeds. The roof had collapsed in the center, a tangled mess of metal and wire. Vines as thick as Frank's arm snaked up the frame, pulling it slowly back to the earth. The air was thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water. Thrilling, Frank said, his voice dry and devoid of humor. He kicked at a piece of bent metal. We paid $200 for a tetanus shot waiting to happen. But Helen wasn't looking at the ruin. She was looking at the bones. She walked forward, pushing through the tall weeds, her hand trailing along one of the main steel beams. It was rusted, but it was solid. She looked down. Beneath the weeds and the broken glass, there was a concrete foundation. Cracked, but it was there. "The frame is good, Frank," she said, her voice quiet. "The foundation is here." Frank walked over to her, his eyes following her gaze. He ran his hand over the steel, his calloused fingers reading the metal like braille. He stomped his foot on the concrete. He looked at the way the trusses were joined, the way the main supports were anchored. The builder in him was taking measurements, making calculations. "It's a Quonset design," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Simple. Strong." He looked up at the gaping holes where the roof should have been. "But it's a wreck." "We don't need all of it," Helen said, her plan starting to take shape in her mind. "We just need a piece of it. One section. 20 feet, maybe." She pointed to the far end of the structure, the section least affected by the roof collapse. "We clear that section. We patch the frame. We find something to cover it. We make one small room." "A room for what?" Frank asked, still skeptical. "To grow weeds in." "A room to live in," Helen said softly. Frank stared at her. "Live in? Here?" "Helen, that's insane." "Is it more insane than living in a car?" she shot back, her voice sharp for the first time. "Is it more insane than waiting for a heart attack in a parking lot behind a Piggly Wiggly? Here, we have land. We have a water spigot. We have a frame." She took a breath, her voice softening again. "We have a place to stand, Frank." For the first time in months. He looked from her face to the skeleton of the greenhouse, then back again. He saw the weeds, the rust, the decay. But he also saw what she saw. Not what it was. What it could be. A project. A purpose. A fight. He nodded slowly, a single, decisive dip of his chin. "All right, Helen," he said. "Let's build a room." That was the beginning of the work. Agency didn't return to them in a flash of inspiration. It returned in calluses and aching muscles. They still slept in the car, but now they parked it inside the gate. Their new home was a construction site. The first task was clearing. It was a brutal, thankless job. Frank, using the rebar as a pry bar and a pair of cheap work gloves from the dollar store, began to dismantle the collapsed section of the roof, piece by tangled piece. Helen, armed with a garbage bag, started the painstaking process of picking up broken glass. She filled bag after bag, her back screaming in protest, her fingers raw. They created a pile of scrap metal on one side of the lot and a mountain of glass shards on the other. Slowly, painfully, a 20 by 30 foot section of the concrete foundation began to emerge from the jungle of weeds and debris. It was their territory. Their first claimed inch of a new world. They worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by peanut butter sandwiches and a grim determination. They discovered the water spigot near the front of the foundation. Frank found a wrench in his old toolbox in the trunk of the car and, after an hour of straining, managed to turn the valve. A torrent of rust-colored water gushed out, then slowly cleared. Clean, cold water. It felt like a miracle. They could wash their faces. They could fill a bottle. They were no longer dependent on the public library bathroom. Every small victory was monumental. Frank found a section of the frame that was bent but not broken. He used the car jack and a length of chain to slowly, carefully, pull it back into alignment. When it settled into place with a deep groan, he and Helen just stood there, staring at the newly straight line against the sky. It was a line of hope. But they were running out of everything. Money. Food. Time. They needed materials. They needed tools. They needed a wall. One afternoon, Frank drove their dwindling pile of scrap metal to the recycling center. He came back with $43 in his pocket. It wasn't enough. "I need a saw," he said, his voice flat with frustration. "I need screws. I need something, anything, to cover this frame." Helen, ever the bookkeeper, looked at their funds. They had just over $100 left. "We'll have to make a choice," she said. Food or materials? It was a choice they didn't have to make. Because that was the day they met Earl Hobbs. Earl owned Hobbs Hardware, a dusty, old-fashioned store that had been on Harmony Creek's main street since before the big box stores arrived on the highway. Earl was a man in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and hands that were permanently stained with grease and wood stain. He had seen Frank at the recycling center. He had seen their old sedan, parked by the derelict greenhouse day after day. He was a curious man. One afternoon, he drove his pickup truck down the service road and pulled up to their gate. He got out and stood there, watching as Frank struggled to cut a piece of salvaged corrugated tin with a pair of flimsy snips. Helen watched him from the shade of the one tree on the property, her heart full of suspicion. Another person come to stare. Another person come to pity or to mock. Earl watched for a full 5 minutes, his expression unreadable. Then he called out, his voice a gravelly baritone. "You're gonna lose a finger doing it that way." Frank stopped, startled. He looked up, his face grim. "It's what I've got," he said, his tone defensive. Earl walked closer, peering at the work. He looked at the cleared patch of concrete. He looked at the straightened beam. He looked at the neat piles of salvaged material. He wasn't looking at two old homeless people. He was looking at a job site. "You're Frank Gable, aren't you?" Earl said. "Used to do carpentry. Built that beautiful deck for the Millers over on Elm Street." Frank straightened up, a flicker of pride cutting through his exhaustion. "I did," he said. "Good work," Earl said. "Solid." He pointed at the frame. "What are you building here?" "A room," Frank said simply. "A room," Earl repeated, nodding slowly. "Right." He looked from Frank to Helen and back again. He understood. He didn't ask about their house, or their son, or why they were living in a ruin. He respected the quiet dignity of their labor too much for that. He was a man who understood the language of work. "You need a reciprocating saw," Earl said. "And some decent blades. And a drill. And self-tapping screws, not that junk you're trying to use." "We can't afford it," Helen said, speaking up for the first time, her voice firm. This was not a charity case. Earl looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a small, kind smile. "I didn't offer to give them to you," he said. "I'm offering you a line of credit." He pulled a small notebook and a pencil from his shirt pocket. "You're a builder," he said to Frank. "I'm a hardware man. This isn't charity. It's a professional courtesy. You take what you need. You sign for it. You pay me back when the job is done." Helen and Frank stared at him. It was the first act of real kindness, of real respect, they had received in months. It wasn't pity. It was solidarity. Frank cleared his throat, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Okay, Earl," he said. "Okay." Earl Hobbs became their first ally. He didn't just give them tools. He brought them 2 folding chairs and a small table. He brought them a cooler filled with ice and bottles of water. One day, he showed up with 2 hot meals from the diner, wrapped in foil. "My wife made too much," he said gruffly, avoiding their eyes. With the right tools, the work accelerated. Frank moved with a renewed purpose. The builder was back. He cut and shaped the salvaged metal, screwing it into the steel frame. A wall began to rise. Then another. They needed a roof. Earl found them a roll of heavy-duty polycarbonate sheeting, left over from another job, and sold it to them at cost. It took them a week to wrestle it into place, but when the last screw was driven home, they had it. A room. 20 feet by 30 feet. It was a patchwork monster of rusted tin, salvaged plywood, and translucent plastic. But it was enclosed. It was dry. That night, for the first time in 3 months, they didn't sleep in the car. They laid a piece of cardboard on the concrete floor, huddled together under their one blanket, and slept inside their creation. The wind howled outside, but inside, it was still. It was the best night's sleep of their lives. The small room became their entire world. Frank built a makeshift door out of scrap wood. He even framed a small window using a piece of unbroken glass they had carefully saved. They moved their few belongings inside. The box of photos. The teapot. Helen's ledgers. It was a hovel. It was a palace. It was home. But Helen, the bookkeeper, knew this was not the end game. This was a temporary reprieve. Their lease was for 1 year. Their savings were gone. They had a growing debt to Earl Hobbs. "We have a greenhouse, Frank," she said one evening, as they watched the sunset through their one small window. "We should probably grow something." Frank snorted. "What, tomatoes? We'd make maybe $50 at the farmer's market." "No," Helen said, her eyes distant. "Not tomatoes." For weeks, during her trips to the library, she hadn't just been seeking warmth. She had been researching. Her bookkeeper's mind, freed from the drudgery of taxes, had become fascinated by a new kind of ledger. The ledger of the natural world. She had devoured books on botany, on horticulture, on niche agricultural markets. She learned about $1,000-a-pound saffron, about the finicky vanilla orchid, about the craze for rare, ornamental peppers. And then she found it. In a dusty botanical journal from the 1970s, she read about a research expedition to a remote, cloud-shrouded mountain in Borneo. The article described a rare, non-parasitic, bioluminescent moss. Noctiluca anaximanderi. It grew only on a specific type of volcanic rock, in near-total darkness, with constant high humidity and a precise, narrow temperature range. It glowed with its own internal light. Most botanists considered it a mere curiosity. It was notoriously impossible to cultivate outside its native habitat. Any attempt to do so had resulted in the moss dying within days. But a footnote in the article caught her eye. It mentioned that the moss seemed to thrive in the presence of low-level galvanic currents, a phenomenon observed when it grew near certain metallic ore deposits in the rock. An idea sparked in her mind. A wild, audacious connection. Their greenhouse was a cage of rusted steel. The ground was damp, constantly wicking moisture from the nearby polluted creek. The structure itself, with its mix of different metals, steel frame, tin walls, copper wiring Frank had salvaged, might be creating a faint electrical field. It was a 1-in-a-million long shot. It was insane. It was perfect. "I found a specialty lab in Oregon," she told Frank. "They have a sample of the moss spores. Preserved. It's $500 for a single vial." Frank stared at her. $500? "Helen, we're in debt for screws and plastic sheeting. We don't have 500 cents. "I know," she said. "We'll have to earn it." The first crop was not the miracle moss. It was basil. And parsley. And mint. Simple, fast-growing herbs. Frank built shallow planting beds from scrap wood and lined them with plastic sheeting. Earl gave them a bag of potting soil and a handful of seed packets, adding them to the tab. The first green shoots pushing through the soil felt like a resurrection. They tended them with a devotion usually reserved for a newborn child. A month later, they had a small but fragrant harvest. They took their meager crop to the Harmony Creek Farmers Market. They set up a small card table at the very end of the row, away from the established farms with their polished displays and colorful banners. Their display was a few bunches of herbs in old glass jars. People walked by, their eyes sliding past them. They were the strange old couple from the junk pile. They sold 3 bunches of basil. Total income, $9. It was humiliating. It was a start. They went back the next week. And the week after. Slowly, a few customers started to notice the quality of their herbs. "This is the best basil I've ever smelled," a woman said, burying her nose in a bunch. They made $20. Then $30. It was a pittance, but they saved every single dollar, tucking it away in the silver teapot. The snowball was beginning to form, molecule by tiny molecule. One Saturday at the market, a young woman with a troubled face and a backpack stopped at their table. She looked to be about 19. She wasn't looking at the herbs. She was looking at Helen and Frank. "You're the Gables, right?" she asked, her voice quiet. "The ones out by the old water plant." Helen nodded, her body tensing. "My name is Maya," the girl said. I need a place to stay. My stepdad kicked me out. I can work. I'll do anything. I'm strong." Helen and Frank looked at each other. They saw in her the same desperation they had felt. The same feeling of being discarded. "We live in a shack made of junk," Frank said bluntly. "We have no room." "I can sleep anywhere," Maya said, her eyes pleading. "I have a tent." Helen made the decision. "There's a dry spot under the frame on the far side," she said. "You can set up your tent there. The work is hard." "Thank you," Maya whispered, a wave of relief washing over her face. "Thank you." Maya became the first member of their found family. She was a tireless worker. She cleared weeds, hauled water, and helped Helen at the farmer's market. She never complained. Her presence changed the dynamic of the place. It was no longer just two old people against the world. It was a team. With Maya's help, they were able to expand. They cleared another section of the greenhouse. Frank built more planting beds. Their harvest doubled. Slowly, painstakingly, the money in the silver teapot grew. It took them 4 months to save the $500. Helen held the cash in her hand, the culmination of so much sweat and toil. She ordered the spores. A week later, a small, insulated package arrived at Earl's hardware store. It felt like they were holding a winning lottery ticket, or a bomb. Now came the hard part. Creating the perfect environment. Frank, guided by Helen's research, set to work. He built a small, 10 by 10 room within their larger structure. A black box. He insulated it with salvaged foam and sealed every crack with black cork. It had to be pitch black. He ran a series of copper wires through the shallow beds of volcanic rock they had bought with their herb money. He connected the wires to a small solar panel and a car battery, a system he jury-rigged himself. It wasn't a galvanic current, but it was a low, steady electrical charge. A desperate imitation of nature. They set up a misting system using a small pump and some vinyl tubing. On the day they planted the spores, the three of them, Helen, Frank, and Maya, stood in the darkness of the black box, the air thick with humidity. Helen carefully uncapped the vial and sprinkled the almost invisible dust over the prepared beds. And then they waited. For a week, nothing happened. Frank checked the battery. Maya checked the misters. Helen checked the temperature. Every day, Frank would open the door a crack, peer into the absolute darkness, and see nothing. "It's a failure," he said on the 7th day, his voice heavy. "We wasted it all, Helen. All that work." "Give it one more night," Helen said, though her own hope was starting to fray. That night, none of them could sleep. Just before dawn, Maya, who had been sitting outside the black box, let out a small gasp. "Helen. Frank. Come here." They scrambled over to her. She was pointing at the bottom of the door. From the tiny crack between the door and the threshold, a faint, impossible light was leaking out. A soft, blue-green glow. Frank's hands trembled as he unlatched the door. He pulled it open. The three of them stared, speechless. The surface of the rock beds was covered in a delicate, velvety carpet that pulsed with a gentle, living light. It was like looking at a galaxy of tiny stars on the ground. It was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. Frank started to laugh. A real, deep, rumbling laugh that shook his whole body. It was the first time Helen had heard him laugh in almost a year. The laugh turned into a whoop of pure joy. "You did it, Helen," he said, turning to her, his eyes shining in the blue-green light. "You magnificent, stubborn woman. You did it." The success of the moss changed everything. They harvested the first batch carefully, placing it in sealed, light-proof containers. Helen found a buyer online. A high-end landscape designer in California who created Starlight Gardens for wealthy clients. She sent him a small, overnighted sample. He called her the next day, his voice electric with excitement. "Where did you get this? How are you growing it? It's perfect. It's stable. I'll buy everything you can produce." He offered them a price that made Helen's hand shake. $5,000 for their first harvest. It was more money than they had seen in a year. The first thing they did was drive to Earl's hardware store. Helen walked up to the counter and placed a thick stack of cash on it. "This should cover our debt," she said. "With interest." Earl counted the money slowly. He looked at the total, then looked at Helen. He pushed a portion of the money back across the counter. "This covers the principal," he said. "There's no interest between friends. Now, what do you need to build next?" The snowball was now an avalanche. With the new capital, they expanded. Frank bought proper steel studs and polycarbonate panels. He and Maya, now his apprentice, began to systematically reclaim the greenhouse, section by section. They built 3 more black boxes for the moss. They installed a proper irrigation system. They ran a new, legal electrical line from the pole on the road. Word of their strange, glowing product and their unlikely success began to spread through Harmony Creek. The laughter had stopped. Now there was a different sound. The sound of whispers. Of jealousy. The ecosystem of their found family grew as well. A retired electrician named Sal, a friend of Earl's, showed up one day and offered to help Frank wire the place properly, just for something to do. A woman named Maria, who had recently lost her husband and her home, came and offered to manage the herb garden in exchange for a place to park her small trailer. The derelict lot was becoming a community. A small island of the lost and the resilient, all working together, all finding a purpose in the shade of the rising glass walls. But success casts a long shadow. And it attracts attention. The threat arrived in a pristine white county vehicle. A man in a crisp shirt with a clipboard stepped out. His name was Mr. Henderson, from the Department of Code Enforcement. "I've received a complaint," he said, his eyes scanning the bustling, chaotic, and frankly illegal construction site. An anonymous complaint about an unpermitted structure and unsanctioned commercial activity. He walked through the greenhouse, his face grim. He saw the patchwork walls. He saw the jury-rigged wiring Sal was in the process of replacing. He saw the unpermitted living quarters in Maria's trailer. His list of violations grew with every step. "This is a disaster," he said, shaking his head. "Structurally unsound. Multiple electrical and fire hazards. Unlicensed commercial horticulture." He stopped, his pen hovering over his clipboard. "I have no choice but to issue a stop work order. And I'm recommending the county terminate your lease and condemn the structure for immediate demolition." The words fell like a death sentence. Demolition. Everything they had built. Everything they had clawed back from the darkness. Gone. Helen's heart sank. The system, the same impersonal, implacable force that had taken their home, had found them again. But this time, they weren't alone. "Now hold on a minute," Earl said, stepping forward. He had arrived with a delivery of PVC pipe and had seen the county car. "These people have done more to improve this garbage dump in 6 months than the city has in 30 years. "That's not the point," Henderson said stiffly. "The point is the code." Maya stepped forward, her hands clenched. "We'll fix it. Just tell us what to do. We'll fix everything." Henderson looked at the small, defiant group. The old hardware store owner. The teenage runaway. The 2 elderly proprietors of this strange enterprise. He sighed, a flicker of something human in his eyes. "You have 30 days, he said, tearing a sheet from his clipboard. 30 days to bring this entire operation up to commercial code. Every structure, every wire, every pipe. If you fail the inspection in 30 days, it all comes down." He handed the list of violations to Helen. It was 3 pages long. It was an impossible task. That night, the mood in the greenhouse was grim. The glowing moss in the black boxes seemed to mock them with its serene, untroubled light. "We can't do it," Frank said, his voice ragged. 30 days? It would take a professional crew 6 months and $100,000. "We have to try," Meyer insisted. Sal, the electrician, looked over the electrical violations. "I can fix this," he said slowly. "But it'll take time. And a lot of copper wire." Maria, the herb gardener, was quiet. "My cousin is a plumber," she said. "Maybe he can help." The community rallied. It was their home, too, now. Earl put a notice up in his store. "Project Greenhouse needs help. Tradesmen wanted. Pay is terrible. Satisfaction is guaranteed." A few retired builders, old friends of Frank and Earl, showed up. A young roofer on his day off came by. The found family expanded, a small army of the willing and the skilled. They worked around the clock, a frantic, desperate push against an impossible deadline. Frank, at 75, was the general on the field, directing the work, his energy seemingly limitless. Helen was the quartermaster, managing the flow of materials, checking off items from Henderson's list, her old ledgers now filled with construction plans and parts lists. The greenhouse was transformed. Patchwork walls were replaced with gleaming polycarbonate. The haphazard wiring was replaced with neat, orderly conduits. Proper foundations were poured for the new sections. It was in the middle of this frantic, hopeful chaos that the ghost returned. A sleek, expensive car, newer than the last one, pulled up to the gate. Richard stepped out. He wore an expensive linen suit and sunglasses that hid his eyes. He looked thinner, harder. He stared in disbelief at the transformed property. At the flurry of activity. At the massive, gleaming structure that had risen from the ruin he had heard people laughing about. He had heard the whispers. He had read a small article in the local paper about the curiosity at the farmer's market. He had put the pieces together. His parents, whom he had left for dead, had stumbled into something valuable. And he had come to claim his share. Frank saw him first. He stopped hammering, his face darkening. The entire work site fell silent. Richard walked toward them, a wide, practiced smile spreading across his face. "Mom? Dad? I can't believe it. I've been so worried. My phone was stolen, my accounts were hacked, it's been a nightmare. I just got back on my feet. The lies were so easy, so smooth." He stopped in front of them, his arms open for a hug. Neither of them moved. "What a setup," he said, letting his arms drop, the smile never wavering. "I knew you had it in you. This is incredible. We can franchise this. We can take this global." He used the word, we. Helen stepped forward. She was no longer the heartbroken mother from Sycamore Lane. She was the woman who had built a world from scratch. Her eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "There is no we, Richard," she said, her voice level and devoid of emotion. "Mom, come on," he wheedled. "I know you're angry. I can explain everything. I can make it right. I have capital now. I can help you expand, take this to the next level." "You are not welcome here," Helen said. "This is my family's business," he said, his voice rising, the charming facade cracking. "I have a right to be here." "You have no rights here," Helen said, her voice cutting through the air. "This property is leased in my name. This business is a sole proprietorship, also in my name. The people you see here are my employees and my partners. You are a trespasser." The bookkeeper had done her homework. She had protected her assets. Richard stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You can't do this," he hissed. "After everything I did for you." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air. Frank took a step forward, his hand clenched around his hammer. But Helen put a hand on his arm. "Leave," she said to Richard. It was not a request. It was a command. Or I will call the police. And this time, they will have a reason to come. Richard looked from his mother's implacable face to his father's simmering rage. He looked at the faces of the strangers surrounding them, all watching him with cold, hard eyes. He was the outsider here. He had no power. He turned without another word, stalked back to his expensive car, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. No one spoke for a moment. Then Frank took a deep breath. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "Back to work. We've got an inspection to pass." The day of the final test arrived. The 30 days were up. Mr. Henderson pulled up in his white county car, his face impassive, his clipboard ready. The entire community stood silently, watching him. Helen and Frank met him at the entrance. "We've done our best," Helen said simply. Henderson began his inspection. He walked slowly, meticulously, through the greenhouse. He looked at the new steel supports, the perfectly sealed polycarbonate panels. He ran his hand over the smooth concrete of the new floor. He went to the electrical panel, where Sal stood waiting. He opened it. Inside, the wiring was a work of art. Every line was straight, every connection perfect, every circuit clearly labeled. Sal had worked for 2 weeks straight, sleeping on a cot in the corner. Henderson grunted, a sound that could have been approval. He checked the plumbing that Maria's cousin had installed. He measured the distance between fire extinguishers. He spent a long time in the black boxes, examining the ventilation and the specialized electrical systems Frank had designed. He made notes on his clipboard, his face giving nothing away. Finally, after 2 hours, he returned to the entrance where Helen and Frank were waiting, their community a silent chorus behind them. Henderson looked down at his 3-page list of violations. He took out his pen. He drew a single, thick line through the first page. Then the second. Then the third. He turned to the final page of his report, the approval form. He made a check mark in a box. Then he signed his name at the bottom. He looked up at Helen, a strange expression on his face. It was respect. "Mrs. Gable," he said, "I have been a code inspector for 20 years. I have never, ever seen anything like this." He shook his head in disbelief. "You haven't just brought this place up to code. You've built a state-of-the-art horticultural facility. The wiring here is better than in the new county courthouse." He handed the signed approval to Helen. "This isn't a junk pile anymore," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "Welcome to Harmony Creek. Your business is officially open." A cheer went up from the crowd. Frank wrapped his arm around Helen, pulling her close. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the crisp paper of the approval form clutched in her hand. Vindication. It was a quiet, solid thing. The aftermath was swift and stunning. The local paper, the one that had printed the small curiosity piece, now ran a front-page story. From homeless to horticultural moguls, the miracle on Creek Road. The story was picked up by a regional news station. The reporter, the young man with the wide eyes, came and filmed a segment. He was fascinated by the glowing moss. That news segment was seen by a researcher at Biogentech, a major pharmaceutical and biotech corporation. They had been searching for a stable, organic, bioluminescent agent for a new type of diagnostic imaging. The properties of Noctiluca anaximanderi were, theoretically, perfect. But no one had ever been able to cultivate it. A team of scientists in expensive suits arrived at the greenhouse. They were skeptical at first, then stunned. Frank's jury-rigged galvanic current system, refined by Sal the electrician, had been the missing piece of the puzzle. It stabilized the moss, allowing it to thrive and reproduce outside its native environment. They had, by accident and desperation, solved a problem that had stumped botanists for 50 years. Biogentech didn't just want to buy their moss. They wanted the process. They wanted the patent. They sent a lawyer, a woman much sharper and more formidable than Richard had ever pretended to be. She sat with Helen and Frank and Maya at the small folding table where they used to eat peanut butter sandwiches. She made them an offer. An exclusive licensing agreement for the cultivation patent. A multi-year contract to be the sole supplier of the moss for their research division. The numbers she presented were so large they seemed like typos. Millions. Not in the future. Now. Helen, the bookkeeper who had once cried over an $80 motel bill, looked at the contract. She didn't look at the numbers. She looked at the clauses. She slid the contract back across the table. "We have some conditions," she said, her voice steady. The lawyer looked surprised. "Our head of operations, Maya, will need to be a salaried consultant on your team," Helen said. Maya, sitting next to her, gasped. "And," Helen continued, "we require you to fund the establishment of the Lumina Community Foundation. Its purpose will be to provide housing and employment for displaced individuals in Harmony Creek." She named a figure for the foundation's initial endowment. It was a significant portion of their first payment. The lawyer stared at her, then slowly smiled. "Done," she said. Richard tried to sue them. He claimed that the initial idea for an agricultural venture was his, and that their success was a direct result of his seed concept. He hired a lawyer who sent them threatening letters. Helen hired her own, using the Biogentech retainer. She provided the lawyer with her old ledgers, the ones that meticulously tracked every loan Richard had taken over 30 years. She provided the forged partnership agreement. She provided the police report on his theft. The lawsuit was dismissed in a single hearing. The judge called it frivolous and frankly insulting. Richard disappeared after that, buried under a mountain of his own debt and disgrace. They never heard from him again. The new normal was better than the old one had ever been. The Lumina greenhouse, as it was now officially known, expanded. They bought the land from the city, and the adjoining 10 acres as well. New, state-of-the-art greenhouses rose next to the original, but Frank insisted they keep the first section, their 20 by 30-foot patchwork room, exactly as it was. It was a museum. A memorial. A reminder. They built a small, comfortable house for themselves on the property, with a wide porch that overlooked the entire operation. They built a small dormitory for the employees who, like Maya, had nowhere else to go. The Lumina Community Foundation, managed by Maria, bought a dilapidated apartment building in town and renovated it, turning it into safe, clean, affordable housing. They didn't just build a business. They rebuilt a community. Helen and Frank were millionaires, but their lives didn't change much. Frank still wore his old work boots and spent his days in the workshop, tinkering, inventing new ways to improve the cultivation systems. Helen still kept the books, her ledgers now tracking millions instead of hundreds, but her handwriting was just as neat, her attention to detail just as sharp. Their greatest luxury was peace. The luxury of not being cold. The luxury of knowing where their next meal was coming from. The luxury of purpose. One evening, 2 years after they had first pushed open that rusted gate, Helen and Frank sat on their new porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. Below them, the greenhouses were beginning to glow. Not just the internal blue-green of the moss, but with the warm yellow light of the work lamps as the night shift came on duty. It was a hive of quiet, productive life. Maya, now a confident young woman of 21, was walking through the rows, talking to the new hires, her laughter carrying on the evening air. Earl, long since retired and now their official consultant, was arguing happily with Sal about the best way to wire a new pump. Frank reached over and took Helen's hand. His hands were still calloused and knotted, but they were warm. "Did you ever think," he said, his voice quiet, "when we were sleeping in the car, did you ever imagine this?" Helen looked out at the glowing buildings, at the community they had built from the ashes of their old life. She thought of the cold, the darkness, the despair. She thought of the first spark of an idea, the first straightened beam, the first green shoot. She thought of the impossible, beautiful light in the black box. On the railing of the porch, in a small pot Frank had made for her, a single, perfect African violet was in bloom. A piece of their old life, replanted in the new. "No," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "I didn't imagine it." She paused, her gaze fixed on the lights. I calculated it.